So, Yanine, you are now going to be starting your new topic, which is on the Cold War. You're going to be looking at two different questions. So, first of all, why did the Cold War start and what the Cold War actually was? And then we're also going to be thinking about why the Cold War didn't develop into a kind of hot war. In terms of what we mean by Cold War, so Cold War was a conflict in a way, because there was massive amounts of tension between the USA and the USSR. But at the same time, it wasn't the same as a war like World War One and World War Two, because the two main sides never engaged in direct conflict. Now, that doesn't mean there was no conflict at all, but the two sides never fought each other directly. They fought proxy wars, so wars in other countries that were designed to kind of reduce the power of the other side, but they never actually fought against each other directly. So today you're going to be looking at this question: how did World War II sow the seeds for the Cold War? So you need to write your title wherever you're taking your notes, whether that's in your book, on paper, or in a Word document. And then I want you to pause your video and have a go at these three questions. So there's a map to help you, but can you think of 3 countries that Nazi Germany invaded? 3 countries who fought against Nazi Germany? And finally, see if you can answer that final question: when did World War II end? So pause your video now to have a go at those starter questions. So hopefully you had a go at those questions and you had a bit of an idea of the answers, but if not, I'm going to tell you them now so you can add them into your notes if you weren't sure. So in terms of countries that Nazi Germany invaded, you could have any from among Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, all of those on this map. Also Italy. You could have also put the USSR because Ukraine was part of the USSR at this time. Just above Ukraine it says BY, that's Belarus, which is also part of the USSR, so you might have had that too. In terms of 3 countries who fought against Nazi Germany, you could have Britain, France, America. You could also have the USSR, which is this country in purple where the Ukraine is. The USSR was invaded but also fought against Nazi Germany. And then finally, for the third question, when did World War II end? It was in 1945. Hitler committed suicide in April, so that ended the war against Germany, but the war against Japan continued into August of 1945. The Cold War developed between 2 of the Allies who fought against Hitler in the Second World War, America and the USSR. So before we think about why tension developed, we need to remind ourselves of who the Allies actually were. So in 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and in response, Germany invaded France. There were other countries within the British Empire that ended up fighting against Germany as well as part of Britain's war with Germany. The Allies joined as well, and so this included a huge range of countries, including Australia, New Zealand, India. And if you see on the middle map here, which is the world map with the red bits on, all of those red countries were part of the British Empire, and they all joined in the fight against Nazi Germany by sending soldiers, resources, money to help Britain in the war. In June 1941, the Soviet Union declared war on Germany because Germany invaded the Soviet Union. So that is when the USSR joined the war. And then in December 1941, the United States also joined the war because Japan, who was an ally with Germany, bombed the ships and the naval base that the United States had in Hawaii. And if you look at the bottom map, you can see where Hawaii is in comparison to America. So by the end of 1941, the main allies, Britain, Soviet Union, and the United States, all united in the war against Germany. There were lots of other countries that joined the fight against the Axis powers. So when I say the Axis powers, that means Germany was the main one, but Italy and Japan were also allies with Germany. And there were lots of other countries that committed to fighting against the Axis powers. So China was major, who fought against Japan primarily. Greece fought against the Germans. and Iraq also fought against the Axis powers alongside many other countries. So the main allies was Britain, the USA and the USSR, but there were lots of other countries who were fighting against Hitler as well. There were some key ideological differences between the allies that had existed before the war, during the war and after the Second World War. Britain was a capitalist empire, which made her quite different from the USA, which was a capitalist democracy. The USA was opposed to empires. They saw them as unequal and like against democratic principles, because Britain ruled countries all around the world, and those countries didn't have a say about how they were ruled. So there were ideological differences between Britain and the USA, but both were capitalist powers, which means that they both believed in private ownership and in private wealth. And therefore they were more similar to each other than they were to the USSR, which was communist. So whereas Britain and America had some disagreements over politics, they were in agreement about economics. Well, the USSR was different from Britain and the USA, both in its politics and its economics. So we're going to look now at what the differences were between capitalism and communism. So I'm going to talk you through the differences between capitalism in the USA and communism in the USSR. There is no need to write anything for now, but I'm going to ask you some questions in a second. So a communist system is both a political one and an economic one. Capitalism is just the type of economy, but normally capitalism comes in a country with a democracy, and the USA had a democracy. So when you compare the politics of a capitalist state and the politics of a communist state, what you find is that in a capitalist state, the general public have much more choice over how they're governed. So there are elections, all adults have a vote, and elections allow them to choose governments. That means that there's competition between different political parties, and the public has a genuine choice between the political party that they choose as the party to govern them. So because of the nature of the democracy, in which there is a choice, in which governments can be removed, people get to enjoy lots of freedoms. So you can criticise the government. You have freedom of speech, freedom of belief, and the government doesn't stop individuals from having those freedoms. If the government attempted to do that, they'd probably be removed in an election. So individuals have more power. However, in a communist system, the politics are there's a one-party state. Now, when there's only one party, individuals don't get a choice about the party that governs them, because that party has ultimate power and is always in government. So even when there are elections, they're sort of fake elections that don't really mean anything, because you can only choose between representatives from one party. In a communist state, the party supposedly governs for the good of the whole people. And therefore, in a communist state, community is more important than individuals. So the idea is that the party protects the community, and whereas in democracy, individuals protect themselves. The party in a communist state also argues that it's best to curtail or restrict individual freedoms in order to protect the whole community. So no freedom of speech is allowed, no freedom of belief is allowed, because the argument is that that will help protect the community. Governments can't be replaced, which makes the government very, very powerful, because they don't have to worry about being removed if they do something that's unpopular. So there are clear political differences. Communist countries argue that democracy is dangerous because it prioritises the individual over the community. And capitalist countries argue that communism is dangerous because it doesn't protect individual rights. When it comes to economics, there's also really important differences. In a capitalist country like the USA, there's private ownership and private profits. So you can own your house, you can own a business, and you can make profit from that business. Because people can have private like earnings and private ownership, it allows some people to have very good opportunities. So if you're born into a family where the family owns the house, that house could eventually be passed down to you in the form of private wealth, and that might help you in later life. You could also be born into a family that can afford to educate you more expensively, which will give you better opportunities. That comes alongside some people having worse opportunities, and if you have worse opportunities, you're less likely to gain wealth. Now that is one of the key criticisms of capitalist economy, because even though some people do really well, lots of people really don't do well. So there's a lot of inequality. In comparison, in a communist system, there is something called public ownership. Now that means that all land and all factories or all shops, all things that would normally generate wealth, is owned by the whole community. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone could walk into a house or anyone could walk into a factory and say, this is mine. It means that the government basically controls all the resources and then divides them up amongst the population. So a factory, if it was making, say, cars, the factory doesn't make lots of profit from the cars. Instead, the factory makes the cars and then the government basically can divide them out. This means that there are far fewer inequalities. However, it also means that there tends to be less wealth to go around. So in a capitalist system, people generally make more profits, whereas in a communist system, there's less profit and there's less to be divided out. So there were fewer inequalities, but most people live in a worse quality of life than they do in a capitalist country. So I'm going to go on to look at some questions now, but if you need to rewind the video, you can always come back to about, when did I stop talking about this? About 8 minutes into the video and listen to this again if you need to. So, what were the differences between communism and capitalism? This is your activity. I want you to write a subheading which says communism, then leave 5 lines or leave a decent space, and then write a second subheading which is capitalism. And then I want you to look at the statements below, these bullet points, there's 6 of them altogether, and I want you to choose which statement works for communism and which works for capitalism and write them underneath the correct subheading. So you'll look at this first one, the government controls all wealth. You need to decide, does that sound like something that would happen in a communist country or a capitalist country? If you think it was a communist country, write it underneath the communism subheading. Okay, pause your video now to have a go. Okay, let's look at the answers then. So for communism, the correct statements have been highlighted in red. So in a communist country, the government controls all wealth, the population cannot challenge an unpopular government, and there's a very small difference between the richest and poorest in society. The capitalist statements are in blue. So in a capitalist country, wealth is controlled by individuals, the population can remove an unpopular government, and there is a big difference between the richest and poorest in society. So if you got any of those incorrect, can you correct your answers now? So clearly there were big differences between communist and capitalist countries. Now this meant that when the USA and the USSR decided to work together to defeat Nazi Germany, in many ways they were unnatural allies. You can get a sense of how different they were as countries from looking at these 2 pictures. So they're both a form of advertising. The one on the left is a form of advertising employed in the United States. It is an advert released by a private company called Hoover, and it's encouraging women to see their lives as being better if they can afford to buy a Hoover. In contrast, on the right, you can see an advert that was produced by the Soviet government, so the government of the USSR. Advertising that's produced by governments for a political purpose is called propaganda. And what you can see here is women working incredibly hard. You can see a collection of women at the bottom all marching together. So it seems like the women have one purpose. They're part of a community. What's being celebrated here is hard work rather than enjoyment of a product like a Hoover. And you can see that whereas in the picture on the left, the 2 women are separated from each other, and there's only 2 women here. On the right, it's all about the community and the collection of women working together. Now, both posters are trying to persuade women that they can have a better quality of life. But whereas in America, women are encouraged to get a better quality of life by spending money, in the USSR, women are encouraged to have a better quality of life by working together and working hard. So this gives you a sense of just how different life was in these 2 different countries and how different the attitudes of the government were. So the USA believed that communism was dangerous because in a communist society, all private wealth and individual freedoms would be taken away, and people would become more poor and less free. Therefore, even though the USA was working with the USSR, the USA throughout the Second World War was very, very worried that communism would spread. So they were working with the USSR, but also they wanted to limit the USSR's influence. The USSR felt the same about America because they believed that capitalism was dangerous, and that in a capitalist society, some individuals did well while most struggled. The USSR believed that if capitalism spread to the USSR, society would become more divided and poverty would grow. So you have this weird situation where countries are working together to defeat a common enemy, but ultimately both sides are really worried about the growing influence of the other. So the strangeness of the biggest capitalist power and the biggest communist power working together did not go unnoticed at the time. And you can see in this source that was published in late 1941, shows Hitler down here as Cupid with his arrow, firing an arrow into Churchill and Roosevelt. And in between Churchill and Roosevelt is Stalin. The source is called Love Conquers All. So it's kind of suggesting that Hitler, as the common danger, has led to Roosevelt, the leader of the USA, Churchill, the leader of the UK, and Stalin, the leader of the USSR, has led them to work together. And there's this kind of suggestion that these three are not naturally together, and that they wouldn't be working together if it weren't for Hitler. So it was recognised at the time that this was an unnatural alliance. So what I would like you to do is to use all the information that you've heard and read so far to answer this question up here. Why might tension grow between the USA and USSR after Hitler had been defeated? So bear in mind what the cartoon suggested on the previous slide, where it was saying that Hitler and the common danger was the reason why these unnatural allies were working together. Bear in mind the information at the bottom of this screen here and the differences in attitudes between quality of life that you can see in these two pictures. So I expect you to be writing for 5 to 10 minutes to answer this question. It should definitely be more than one sentence. See if you can do a short paragraph to explain this. And you might want to use the key word of ideological differences. And ideological differences are differences in ideas, and that is basically explained at the bottom of this screen here. So try and use that keyword in your answer. You can pause your video now. So in the next few slides, you're going to hear about why tension grew between 1945. You're going to hear about the Yalta and Potsdam conferences that occurred in February and then in June of 1945. And then you'll hear about the atom bomb that was used on Japan by the United States. Each of these events led to increasing tension between the Allies. So after looking at the information for each event, you need to describe how the relationship between the Allies changed. So the question you need to answer first is at the top of the screen. Why was there tension between the Allies after the Yalta Conference? To start, write a subheading saying Yalta Conference. Then I want you to read the information and explain your answer to that question. Why was there tension between the Allies after the Yalta Conference? Pause your video now to have a go at the question. After the Yalta Conference, the situation in the Second World War changed quite quickly and quite dramatically. You can see in the map at the bottom of the screen that the Soviet Union conquered all the area that is portrayed in purple. So these were regions that had previously included countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. All of these countries had been taken over by the Nazis during the war. And the Soviet Union liberated all of the countries, defeated the Nazis, and forced the Nazis to retreat into Germany. And then in April 1945, the forces of the Soviet Union entered Berlin and fought a battle against the German soldiers that remained in Berlin. And you can see them here raising the flag of the Soviet Union above the Reichstag, which was in the centre of Berlin. This is the moment when Hitler commits suicide and the war against Germany ends. And as you can see, the role of the Soviet Union was far greater in the end of the war than the United States and the UK. That's not to say the United States and the UK didn't play a huge role, they certainly did. But in terms of kind of prompting or generating the end of the war against Germany, the Soviet Union were clearly the dominant force. So when the Allies met again at Potsdam in July 1945, there was a recognition from Britain and America that they would not have been there, they would not have been able to meet under the circumstances that they did if it hadn't been for the Soviet Union. And that put the Soviet Union in a position of quite a lot of power. Okay, so next we're going to look at the Potsdam Conference. If you do a subheading of Potsdam Conference, the picture you can see here shows Stalin meeting with President Attlee, who's Prime Minister Attlee, who is the new leader of Britain, and President Truman, who is the new leader of the United States. And when the Allies met in July 1945, there was far more tension than there had been at Yalta. Now, you might find that slightly strange because they are meeting as they're much more confident because they have just defeated Hitler. Japan hadn't been defeated yet, but Hitler and Italy both had. So you would be thinking they'd be feeling pretty pleased with themselves. However, there was a lot of disagreement. So those countries that I just showed you on the map, just here, the countries in purple, these had all been liberated by the Soviet Union or the USSR as they forced the Nazis to leave. Now, what Truman and Attlee wanted was that these countries, so countries like Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, would have their own elections, and that these elections would decide the governments of these countries. However, what it seemed like was happening is that Stalin, to protect his sort of Soviet sphere of influence, as he liked to call it, to protect that region that bordered the Soviet Union, he was setting up communist governments in Eastern Europe without holding free and fair elections. And there were growing concerns that Stalin would basically force these countries to become communist. This was making particularly Truman very angry because he wanted to make sure that Europe remained a predominantly capitalist continent rather than a predominantly communist one. There were also disagreements because the USSR was really keen to cripple Germany. So the USSR wanted to introduce huge reparations that Germany would have to pay to the USSR to make up for the losses that the USSR had sustained during the war. Stalin also wanted to make sure that Germany could never become a strong industrial power again. And you can see why he wanted that. Ultimately, Germany had invaded the USSR, or Russia, as it had previously been the country of Russia. And there had been 2 invasions in the past 50 years, both which have been led by Germany. So Stalin was really keen to make sure that Germany could never lead a war against Russia or the Soviet Union ever again. But this really concerned Truman because Truman had seen that after the First World War, when Germany had been punished with reparations during the treaty, or as a result of the Treaty of Versailles, that had encouraged Germany to then start the Second World War. So he wanted to avoid that from happening. So there were disagreements over that. Truman as well was he was personally suspicious of Stalin, whereas the previous president, Roosevelt, had been much more willing to get on with him. So that caused tension too. And there wasn't really much Truman could do about the fact that communist governments existed in Europe, because Stalin was, he had more influence there. He had troops stationed there. So there was a lot of feelings of distrust between the Allies, and particularly from Truman, a sense that Stalin was introducing too much of his own power in the east of Europe. So I want you to pause your video now and have a go at answering that question. So the month after Potsdam, an event occurred which, whereas previously Truman had been feeling quite powerless in his relationship with Stalin, in August, Stalin began to feel very powerless in contrast. And that was because of the bombing of Japan by the United States. So without telling the USSR, the USA had been creating an atomic bomb. Now this was a bit unusual because you would expect that if an alliance was creating such a powerful weapon as this, you would be keen to tell your allies. So the fact that America had developed this weapon without telling Stalin made him very suspicious. particularly because Stalin had found out from his spies that this was happening, and he'd kind of been waiting to be told and never was. In fact, he was told whilst at Potsdam that this atomic bomb had been successfully tested. And so it happened just as the relationship between the alliances was worsening. Stalin was then told about this bomb, which kind of increased his anger. So the bomb was used in August in Japan, first of all in Hiroshima and then in Nagasaki. And you can see at the bottom, this picture here, just the extent of the damage that was done. So this previously would have been covered with buildings and houses, and they're almost all been completely flattened by the bomb. And at least 75,000 people were killed instantly, and many more thousands died afterwards as a result of injuries or after effects of the bomb. So tension had already been growing between the allies, and now basically the USA had shown that they were militarily superior to the USSR. And this was terrifying for Stalin, because the USA now had the ability to destroy the USSR, and the USSR did not have the ability to do it back. So the USSR immediately tried to create their own atomic bomb, but in the kind of immediate impact, which they couldn't create a bomb immediately, so instead they became more kind of aggressive, although they probably would have called it defensive. They became more defensive in their approach to Eastern Europe, as in they thought that Eastern Europe was particularly important in providing a kind of buffer between the capitalist powers and the USSR. And so the actions that the Soviets took in Eastern Europe became increasingly aggressive, trying to assert their control over Eastern Europe. So could you pause your video now and have a go at that question at the top of your screen? Your final activity for today is to think about what the most important reason was for tension between the Allies by the end of World War II. There are lots of different reasons why there was tension. One of those reasons was ideological differences. So the fact that the USA was scared about communist power, the fact that the USSR was convinced that capitalist powers wanted to destroy the USSR, that resulted from differences in ideas about the way that the economy should be run and the way that the government should be run. And those differences in ideas led to fear of the other powers' ideas. And so those ideological differences were the reason for the falling out between the Allies. Another reason was that the USA and USSR disagreed over what to do about Germany. The USA and the USSR also disagreed about the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and how much power the USSR should have in Eastern Europe. And finally, the USSR was very scared about the atomic bomb. So what I'd like you to do is to choose which of those you think is the most important cause of tension and explain why you think this. If you could, when you do this, write out the bullet point that you think is most important, and then underneath explain why you think that was the most important cause of tension. So pause your video now to have a go. So it doesn't really matter much which one you chose, but I wanted to let you know which I thought it was. So in my opinion, the most important reason why there was tension between the Allies is the top one, ideological differences. Because if the ideological differences hadn't been there, it's likely that the USA and USSR would have been far more in agreement about what to do in Europe after the war. The ideological differences between the two powers was the reason why one was scared of the other. If it hadn't been for the ideological differences, there might have been competition between the two powers of who got their way, but there wouldn't have been that kind of background fear of the other. And so there would have been far easier, or would have been much more likely that they could have found a solution that worked for both of them. So that's why I would say the first is the most important. But if you put a different one, that is absolutely fine. So well done, Year 9. You come to the end of this first lesson on the Cold War. When you're ready, go on to the final lesson for this week, which is on how the Cold War developed in the years between 1945 and 1950. Thanks very much, Year 9. Well done, and keep your notes safe, ready for when you come back to school.